their bombs on the city. All but one of the Mitchells escaped to safety in mainland China or Russia. In the wake of the attack that became known after its commander as the Doolittle Raid, there was consternation amongst Japanese military leaders. Although the raid had caused only minor material damage, it had struck an immense blow to Japan's national pride. The need to protect the emperor was at the very core of the armed forces' being, and an agony of shame swept through the high command. Japan's leaders quickly concluded that there was only one way in which the homeland and the emperor could be adequately protected. The frontiers of the empire must be pushed even further into the Pacific. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo had been appointed Prime Minister of Imperial Japan. As Army Chief of Staff, Tojo's greatest ambition was to see a successful conclusion to the Japanese campaign in China, and he was convinced that the only possible way of achieving this was to win a sharp victory over the Western powers. On his appointment as Prime Minister, General Tojo had kept his post as Chief of Staff and the job of War Minister. However, although an immensely powerful figure, Tojo did not have complete control of government policy. In a cabinet in which all the armed forces were represented, he could count only on the support of the army, and most decisions were ultimately a compromise between army and navy. Even before the Doolittle Raid, extending the perimeter of the empire into the Pacific had been a cherished ambition of an influential naval faction. After the raid, arguments between the army and navy evaporated. Because the proposed operation would demand little army participation, Tojo finally gave his support. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been elected President of the United States in 1932. Deeply opposed to the general mood of isolationism, Roosevelt believed that America should play an active role on the world stage. Even before the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany's ambitions. After the German conquest of the continent in 1940, Roosevelt, in spite of domestic opposition, increasingly supported Britain in her struggle for survival. It was also Roosevelt who, in retaliation for Japanese actions against China, had imposed the oil and trade embargo on Japan. As a former Assistant Secretary to the Navy, and now as its Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt took a special interest in the service. He chose his own flag and staff officers, and was so determined that the Navy should be run by the best man for the job, that he even selected a member of the opposition Republican Party, Frank Knox, to head the Navy Department. Under Roosevelt and Knox, the naval budget steadily rose. Even after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt believed, contrary to the wishes of the American public, that the war in Europe should be given priority over actions in the Pacific. He understood that enormous resources would be needed to push back the tide of Japanese conquests. And until the full might of American industry could be brought to bear, the United States would have to concentrate on holding the line. Roosevelt insisted that further Japanese expansion must be countered at all costs. The extension of the Japanese defensive perimeter in the Pacific, although logistically complex, was expected by the Imperial High Command to pose few real problems. On the islands to be invaded, enemy forces were weak, and at sea it seemed there was little to fear from the Americans or the British. The Japanese Navy, the driving force behind the plan, was supremely confident. The first stage of the Japanese plan of conquest was to complete the occupation of New Guinea. By April 1942, New Guinea had already been partly conquered, and the Japanese were anxious to deny the whole island to the Allies. An advanced striking force of troop transports and heavy cruisers would be assembled in Rabaul, along with 3 aircraft carriers at Truk. The force from Rabaul would sail south, then split into 2 divisions. The first was to seize Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. The second, supported by 1 aircraft carrier from Truk, was to capture Port Moresby. The remaining 2 carriers would enter the Coral Sea and engage any enemy found there. Once New Guinea had been occupied, then New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would easily be captured. To extend the Japanese line in the north, 3 islands of the Aleutian chain, Attu, Kiska, and Adak, would be added to the list of conquests. The next stage in the Japanese advance would be the occupation of the American-held island of Midway, 1,136 miles west of Hawaii. The capture of Midway would win for the Empire an airstrip within striking distance of the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Although the capture of Midway would provide a vital stepping stone in any future action against Hawaii, the operation would also have another equally important objective. It would be used to lure American aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor and force them to fight a battle that would end in their destruction. The plan to capture Midway and defeat the American carrier fleet was a complex and intricate combination of invasion, diversionary action, and ambush. The first step in the Midway offensive would be the dispatch of a Japanese submarine fleet to set up 2 reconnaissance cordons, one 500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and the other between Hawaii and Midway. While the submarines were taking up their positions, a Midway occupation force, consisting of troop ships supported by a heavy cruiser division, would set out from the Marianas and head northeast towards Midway. To destroy Midway's defenses and ambush the American carrier fleet, a carrier strike force was assembled, made up of 4 aircraft carriers, supported by battleships, heavy cruisers, and a powerful destroyer screen. The carriers and their support would sortie east through the Bungo Channel, they would be followed by a main force of 6 battleships.